The Dark Scrolls. Imagine yourself stepping into a European village during the Middle Ages. The air is thick with the scent of damp grass, burned straw, and human sweat. The cobbled streets are slick with mud and waste, winding past crumbling taverns, shadowy chapels, and alleys whose names people only dare whisper after nightfall. As you walk, you pass a narrow lane, half swallowed by the gloom. A crooked wooden sign hangs above it, swaying in the wind, carved with a name so vulgar it would make any mother clasp her child's ears. Gropecunt Lane. Yes, this is no invention, no dirty joke passed through time. It existed. And what's more, it thrived. Here, women wrapped in thick woolen garments and heavy veils leaned against the stone walls, eyes glinting with both defiance and despair. Prostitutes, yes, but not hidden, not hunted. They were known, accepted, and in many cases regulated by the very city they served. Prostitution in medieval Europe was not merely overlooked, it was regulated and incorporated into the very structure of society. Town councils, particularly in busy trade centers and seaports, officially licensed brothels, imposed taxes on them, and dictated specific areas where such establishments could exist. The rationale, oddly enough, was framed as a form of moral control. Better to manage temptation than let it spiral unchecked. Containment, they believed, was safer than chaos. Better to direct desire into designated places than risk it threatening the institution of marriage. Yet this outwardly pragmatic approach masked a society deeply entangled in contradiction. While church doctrine sternly denounced almost every expression of physical intimacy, preaching chastity before marriage and restraint, even within it, the lived reality was far less orderly. Beneath the sermons and confessions, human nature found its way, at times in hidden corners, at others in ways that were deeply unsettling. Not far from the infamous Gropecunt Lane, a real street name from medieval records, stood a manor house, towering over the village like a brooding sentinel of another age. Within its stone walls, stories passed down through generations spoke of a grim custom once whispered in fear, the so-called right of the first night, or droit du seigneur. According to legend, local lords claimed the authority to spend the wedding night with any peasant bride under their domain. Picture a young woman, barely past childhood, newly wed, still in a simple woolen dress passed down from her mother. As dusk falls and her neighbors raise cups in celebration, a messenger arrives. In his hands not a blade but a scroll, a command. She is to be escorted to the manor. Her fate, they say, is not hers tonight. Historians debate whether this right was ever truly enforced, or whether it was a distorted tale born from older customs. Some suggest it stemmed from the merchet, a fee families paid to their lord when daughters married. But myth or not, the persistence of this story reveals a dark truth. Women's autonomy could be treated as property, their lives subject to transactions beyond their control. Even if no law ever carved it into stone, the fear it instilled and the power it represented was real. And so desire in the Middle Ages was caught between forces, raw human instinct, and a system built to suppress it through fear, shame, and power. The church, the crown, the town square, each had its own rules, its own expectations, and none of them, not a single one, allowed for joy without consequence. In the homes of the faithful, where fear of sin hovered like smoke from the hearth, couples went to bed not for pleasure, but out of duty. Many devout husbands and wives adopted a peculiar custom, an act of religious modesty so extreme it would seem absurd today. The chemise cagoule was a garment worn during intercourse. A heavy nightshirt, often made of linen or coarse wool, with a single slit cut strategically to allow only the minimum physical contact required for reproduction. Everything else, every glance, every touch, every expression, was hidden. Imagine lying next to your spouse, your bodies covered entirely, faces unseen, breath warm beneath fabric, performing an act as ancient as time itself, yet feeling as though you're confessing a sin with every motion. That was the point. The garment was not designed for comfort or even efficiency. It was a statement that sex, even within marriage, was inherently shameful, that the act of creating life was to be endured, not enjoyed. And yet the human body does not yield so easily to doctrine. Even within monasteries cloistered from the world, where men were taught to reject all carnal temptation, something else stirred beneath the robes. Among monks and clerics, a ceremony called adelphopoiesis, literally brother-making, was performed. On the surface, it was a spiritual union, a declaration of sacred friendship between two men. But to some, it was more than that. In the candlelit corners of abbey libraries and silent gardens behind stone walls, these brothers found in one another the warmth they were forbidden to seek elsewhere. Not all of them, of course, but enough that church authorities began to watch these spiritual unions with suspicion. Enough that stories survive of monks caught not just whispering, but touching, trembling, kissing in the dark, each kiss carrying the weight of mortal sin. Still, for many, the risk was worth it. They were told to reject the flesh, but the flesh had its own needs, its own logic. And love, in any form, is rarely so easily denied. Beyond monasteries and bedrooms, even the act itself, the mechanics of sex, was shaped by the laws of fear. Certain forms of intercourse were deemed unnatural, even damnable. Among them, intercrural sex. A term foreign to most today, intercrural sex referred to the act of a man placing his penis between the thighs of his partner, without penetration. It was often associated with same-sex relationships as a way to simulate intercourse without crossing what was believed to be the ultimate line of sin. In some cases, heterosexual couples practiced it to avoid pregnancy while still maintaining some level of intimacy. It was a loophole, a compromise, a way of saying, "I want you, but not enough to burn for it." In many medieval legal texts, especially in cases of sodomy trials, intercrural sex is mentioned as a lesser offense. Not quite innocence, but not quite damnation. Like walking along the edge of a cliff, eyes closed, praying the wind doesn't change. As the church's grip tightened, so too did the complexity of its rules. Not only was sex outside of marriage forbidden, sex within marriage came with its own tangled script. No sex on holy days, no sex during Lent or Advent, no sex while the wife was menstruating or pregnant or breastfeeding. And even when sex was allowed, it had to be for procreation, never for pleasure. Even the positions were regulated. Missionary, man on top, facing each other, was considered the only acceptable form. Anything else, especially rear entry or woman on top, was seen as animalistic, deviant, or dangerously close to mimicking the sins of Sodom. And so from brothels to bridal beds, from monasteries to manor halls, the medieval world crafted a landscape of repression cloaked in righteousness. But no matter how high the walls, how many rules, how many threats of damnation, desire found a way. Sometimes it slipped through the cracks in a cassock. Sometimes it hid beneath a linen shift. Sometimes it stood openly on a street named Grope Cunt Lane. And as we leave that filthy cobbled alley and look back once more, we might ask, were they truly so different from us? Or did they simply lack the words and the freedom to name what they felt? As the moon rises over the medieval village and the last echoes of the market fade into a hush, something else begins to stir. Not voices, not footsteps, but thoughts. Repressed, forbidden, tangled thoughts that swirl in the minds of peasants, priests, and princes alike. Desire in the Middle Ages was not only bound by the walls of flesh, it was chained, gagged, and burned. The church had grown powerful, its words reaching into every bedroom, every mind, every corner of the known world. And with that power came fear. Not just fear of damnation, fear of discovery. What if someone knew? What if someone saw? What if someone told? The idea that sexual thought alone could lead to eternal torment was not metaphor, it was dogma. To lust in one's heart was already to commit the sin of fornication. A fleeting glance, a wayward dream, even the mere memory of a touch could demand penance. For women it was worse. Their bodies were seen as gateways to sin, temptations in skin and scent. A woman's beauty was a weapon against man's holiness, and therefore must be covered, subdued, denied. But when suppression fails, punishment follows. One of the most feared tools of church discipline was the public confession, but in the realm of sexual sin it could become a public execution in all but name. Take, for instance, the penitent processions in southern France. Those accused of fornication or adultery, sometimes merely suspected, would be stripped nearly naked, paraded through the streets, flogged by monks chanting psalms. They walked barefoot over stones, blood trickling down their backs, their eyes never lifting from the ground. To the crowd, it was justice. To the church, purification. But to the one bleeding, it was humiliation sharpened to a blade. In extreme cases, the punishment became literal fire. Sodomy, defined broadly to include homosexual acts, oral sex, rear entry, and more, was not only condemned, it was criminalized. Trials were held, witnesses were summoned. Accused men, sometimes women, were dragged through the streets and tied to pyres. The fire that consumed them was framed not as vengeance, but as mercy. Burn the sin, save the soul, and so sex and death became neighbors. Yet even kings, those crowned by God and revered by men, were not immune to the church's gaze. If anything, they lived in a tighter vice, expected to be holy, yet virile, faithful, yet fruitful, and above all, publicly flawless. Behind closed doors, however, the contradictions multiplied. Consider the royal marriage bed. A place not of passion, but of politics. Every royal union was calculated to bind kingdoms, to produce heirs, to signal strength. Love was a luxury rarely afforded. Pleasure, less so, but the act of consummation had to be witnessed, literally. In many medieval courts, once the wedding feast ended, the bride and groom were escorted to their chamber. Not alone, but with a procession of noblemen and clergymen. The couple would undress beneath the scrutinizing gaze of bishops and ambassadors. Once in bed, the curtains were drawn, but not always completely. Sounds were listened for, movements noted. In France, this was known as la cérémonie du lit. In England, it was simply the bedding. In Spain, it often involved priests blessing the sheets before the act even began. The implication was clear. Sex was not private, not for royals. It was national policy in motion. But what happened when a king failed to perform? Whispers began. And whispers in medieval courts were poison. In some cases, physicians were summoned not just for health, but to verify virility. Kings were examined like livestock. Their seed, if insufficient, became a matter of state concern. And if queens failed to conceive, their bodies were blamed. Wombs were suspected of being cold, blocked, or cursed. Midwives were brought to massage, bleed, and insert herbs, sometimes violently, into the most sacred parts of the queen's anatomy. In one infamous case, a barren queen was advised to spend her nights sleeping with a fertile wet nurse pressed against her belly, in hopes the heat and fertile essence would flow into her. Nothing did. But the attempts continued because failing to produce an heir was more dangerous than any humiliating remedy. And still, amidst these royal rituals, the rest of society kept inventing its own ways to deal with forbidden desire. Some tried to deny it altogether. Others found creative outlets. One such outlet was the use of so-called holy relics as sexual talismans. Women would visit shrines of female saints, praying for fertility, but also smuggling home small cloths that had been touched to the saints' bones. These cloths were then placed under the bed or between their thighs on wedding nights as divine lubricants, protectors, or enhancers. For men, pilgrimages became excuses. A journey to Canterbury or Santiago de Compostela might include not just prayers, but visits to discreet brothels along the way, where clerics removed their robes and travelers their guilt. One London brothel even advertised virgins blessed by relics, though no one questioned which relics or how they were blessed. And then there were the chastity belts. Much has been said about them, most of it false. These iron devices, said to be locked around women's waists while their husbands went off to war, have been mostly debunked as myths. Most real examples are Victorian fakes, created more out of fascination with perversion than historical use. But the fact that people believed in them tells a deeper truth. In a world so obsessed with female purity, so afraid of female pleasure, so suspicious of women's bodies, it made sense. Of course, men would want to lock their wives shut. Of course, society would cheer it on. Even outside the family, women bore the weight of moral suspicion. Widows were often viewed as dangerously free. Unmarried women were labeled temptresses or heretics, and midwives, those who knew the secrets of the female body, were regularly accused of witchcraft. Knowledge was dangerous. A woman who understood her own anatomy could not be trusted. And so entire generations of girls were raised without the words to describe what they felt, what they wanted, what they feared. Their first bleed came with whispers, their wedding night with tears. Their desires, if they surfaced, were buried beneath shame. Yet they were not without rebellion. In Italy, young women would wear perfume in their underclothes, not for others, but for themselves. In parts of Germany, secret bride books were passed from sister to sister, full of drawings, notes, and instructions. Not always accurate, but always personal, always private. And then there was the laughter. Yes, even in a world so dark, there was laughter. Songs, bawdy poems, woodcut prints with grinning devils and naked saints. The taverns echoed with dirty jokes. Farmers carved phallic symbols into fences for luck. Women painted eyes on their thighs to trick the devil during sex. Because sometimes mockery was the only way to survive repression. Sometimes laughter was resistance. Now the fire burns lower in the hearth. The village sleeps. But desire never does. It moves like smoke under doorways, into dreams, into prayers, into punishments. In the next and final part, we will descend even deeper into the terrifying intersections of sexuality, madness, torture, and control. Where love becomes a weapon, where purity becomes a sentence, where even the innocent learn to be afraid of their own skin. As dawn breaks over the fields beyond the village, light spills across the stones of Gropecunt Lane, now silent. The taverns are shuttered, the church bells toll, but something lingers in the air, a weight that no morning mist can lift. It is the memory of touch, of secrets, of skin. In this world built on shame and punishment, perhaps the most painful wounds were those never bled, the ones buried in the hearts of those who never dared speak. Because while the church punished the body, society punished the soul, and nowhere was this more brutal than in the lives of those marked impure from birth. Consider the fate of a child born out of wedlock, a bastard. No matter how loving their mother, how noble their blood, they were cursed by origin alone, denied inheritance, denied titles, denied names. Some were abandoned to convents. Others, if lucky, were raised by their mothers in silence and fear, told never to ask about their fathers. But there were other children whose suffering was worse still. Children born from sin, children born of rape. Behind castle walls and inside peasant huts alike, violence was not uncommon. A feudal lord who defiled a servant girl rarely faced consequences. A husband who forced himself on his wife, because yes, even wives could be raped, was not seen as a criminal. After all, she was his property. She owed him her body. And so many children entered the world as the product of fear, of silence, of trauma never named. They bore no marks, but they inherited everything. Even in the rare cases where women sought help, the church's remedy was often worse than the crime. To be raped was to be stained. To accuse was to invite suspicion. Had she tempted him? Had she been alone? Had she spoken too freely? And so most women said nothing. They swallowed their pain and wore veils not of fabric, but of forced silence. Sometimes the only safe space left was the convent. Behind high walls, women, many from noble families, were cloistered not by calling but by convenience. A daughter deemed unmarriageable due to disfigurement, scandal, or simply cost might be offered to God. And once inside, she was expected to obey without question. But convents were not always places of peace. Within their walls, a different kind of repression took hold. In some, the rules were so strict that nuns could not speak, could not write, could not even look directly at one another. Meals were taken in silence. Punishments were severe. A dropped plate might earn a week of fasting, a laugh, a whipping, a daydream, confession and penance. Yet even here, desire found a way. Some nuns fell in love, with one another, with visiting priests, with the very idea of forbidden touch. And when they did, the punishments came fast and without mercy. In 1475, in a convent near Florence, 2 women were found sharing a bed. The abbess ordered them stripped, tied, and scourged before the altar. Their cries, it is said, echoed through the chapel like a hymn of mourning. And what of those accused of witchcraft? Here, the connection to sexuality became even more grotesque. Many women branded as witches were midwives, healers, or simply outspoken. But the charges almost always had a sexual undercurrent, that they lay with the devil, that they seduced men in their sleep, that they practiced obscene rituals in the woods. The Malleus Maleficarum, the infamous witch-hunting manual, claimed women were more prone to witchcraft because they were carnal, insatiable, and deceitful. It warned that witches could steal men's penises through magic, cause impotence, or even birth demons through unnatural unions. And so torture chambers were built not just to break the body, but to extract confessions that would fit a narrative of lust and evil. Women were stripped, their genitals examined for witches' marks. Hot irons were pressed against their thighs. Vaginal torture was not uncommon, and if they screamed, it was proof of guilt. If they confessed, it was because the devil had loosed their tongues. If they died, it was because their soul was already lost. The body, once again, became the battlefield. And yet, for all this horror, some found ways to endure. Some sang hymns through clenched teeth. Some carved poems into the walls of their cells. Some held the hands of their fellow accused and refused to cry. And some, even as the flames rose around them, looked to the crowd with eyes that said, "You will remember me." Because ultimately, that's what this story is. A remembering, a reclaiming, a recognition that for centuries, sex was not a joy, but a judgment. That desire was not a right, but a risk. That the human body, its hunger, its heat, its softness, was treated as something to fear, control, and punish. But we remember. We remember the bride trembling under linen. We remember the monk whispering in the dark. We remember the nun bruised by obedience. We remember the woman tied to the stake, who closed her eyes not out of fear, but because she had nothing left to see. And in remembering them, we reclaim what was taken. Their stories were hidden beneath centuries of stone and ash, but they are not gone. They are in the names of alleys and the cracks of church walls. They are in the folk songs sung under breath, the sketches in ancient margins, the bones buried too shallow. They are in us, because repression leaves a stain, but resistance leaves a legacy. So the next time you pass through an old town and you see a crooked street sign or feel the silence in a stone chapel, ask yourself, what once happened here? And more importantly,
Thanks
who
for
survived
watching.
it, even in
Subscribe for
silence?
more.